longtime leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Dr. Chuman teaches human rights at the graduate level at Columbia University and has taught the United Nations University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica. He has published numerous articles in the Record of Bergen County, New Jersey. In fact, he just had a letter published in yesterday's Record on the opinion page on religion's moral duty to protect the health and welfare of all of us. Your topic this morning is Out of Disaster, Good Things Can Happen. And now, please welcome Joe.
Oh, well, thank you so very much, Susan. It's really a joy to be with you. My goodness, we seem to attract more people online than we do in person, which says something very positive, I think, about this format. It has its liabilities, but also its strengths. I hope all of you are well and keeping yourself safe. What I wanted to do, of course, it's hard to talk about anything these days other than the pandemic and its ramifications. And I've been doing a lot of reading and opinion pieces about what people opine will occur after the epidemic passes. And they range from dystopian on the one hand to hopeful on the other. And I wanted to lend my voice to that. And I should say I err on the side of being hopeful. And I want to basically explain why I do and what the content of my hopeful vision is. So there we go. I ask you, if you will, to be a little bit patient with me. I'm reading off of a screen, and sometimes my hand slips and I lose my place, so it may take a little bit of time to get back into it. But here we go. There is no good purpose, excuse me. We are already having a little bit of technical problem here. Yeah, there is no good purpose in minimizing the conditions that we're in. I temperamentally am the type of person who doesn't want to sugarcoat things that are not going well. Humanity is experiencing a disaster, as we know, of literally global proportions with very few precedents. Close to 250,000 people have died worldwide, and almost 3.5 million have contracted the virus. Those, as we know, are the confirmed cases, signifying that the real numbers are probably much higher, and many more tragically will continue to die. But as long as we are pushed forward by the imperatives of our biology, we have no choice but to look to the future and work to ensure that things will get better. In other words, as long as there is life and a will to live, there is hope. It is my presumption that that it is a principle of a humanist outlook that the future is an open future. And if not totally, then in great measure is up to us human beings to create that future. Not all people, however, believe in an open future. Conservative Christians, for example, believe in a closed future. They believe that the ultimate fate of human beings is preordained, and at some point the world and human civilization as we know it will endure an apocalyptic war between the legions of Christ and the Antichrist. True believers will enjoy eternal life, and sinners, I guess that includes us, will be damned to hell without end. And that's it, folks. Story over. In a parallel vein, ultra-Orthodox Jews believe in a closed future. They believe in the ultimate coming of the Messiah, at which point the righteous will be resurrected. And in one interpretation, there are several, none are dogmatic in Judaism, Jews will return to their ancestral Holy Land and find the freedom to spend all eternity studying Torah, unmolested by their Gentile persecutors. It's always seemed to me to be a relatively modest ending of human history, but it endures as a mainstay of traditional belief. It was Maimonides, the greatest Jewish theologian of the 12th century, who laid down the 13 central principles of the Jewish faith, the 12th being, quote, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, and though he may tarry, yet still I will believe in him, end quote. And though the Messiah continues to tarry for a very long time, Messianic belief is a central devotion of Hasidic Jewish belief especially, and it's in fact experiencing something of a resurgence in our current day. But not all closed future advocates are religious. Some, in fact, have been fervently secular. Among believers in a closed future are orthodox Marxists, of which I construe there are really very few these days, although for quite a while there were many, very many. By the lights of orthodox Marxism, history progresses by inexorable laws under the rubric of what Karl Marx coined as historical materialism. The engine that pushes history ahead is the class struggle, rooted in the fact that there is a ruling class that owns the means of production and an oppressed class which does not. Because of the dynamics of oppression, history is characterized by a perpetual class struggle of the oppressed against the oppressors. In the ancient world, the oppressed class was the slave class, and the ruling class were the Roman aristocrats. In fact, Karl Marx looked at the Spartacus rebellion of about 70 BCE as the first instantiation of the class struggle. In the modern world, the ruling class, of course, is the capitalist class, and the oppressed are the proletariat, the working class. History, again, is moved along by this conflictual dynamic, and it was Marx's interpretation that the struggle between the proletariat and the capitalists was history's final struggle. In other terms, Marx's view of history was dialectical, something he appropriated from the philosopher George Friedrich Hegel. The ruling class represented the thesis, the oppressed class the antithesis, and their conflict, their inevitable conflict with one another, results in the synthesis, a new form of society. History's last struggle would result in the proletariats vanquishing the oppressors and instituting a communist society in which the means of production would be owned by the producers themselves, that is, the proletariat broadly understood. Human alienation and the oppression marked by the different classes would be resolved, and history would come to an end. Some interpreters of Marx see vestiges of his Jewish background and its messianism animating Marx's thought. But Marx himself claimed that his interpretation of history and its deterministic laws were in fact scientific, while it seemed to most others that he in fact had imposed his philosophical notions onto history rather than deriving laws from history itself. Marx, as a rabid atheist, did not believe in a divine hand guiding history, but rather the allegedly inexorable and deterministic laws of history that made sure that history would end in a kind of communist utopia, which he prophesized but never really fully described. He had once, however, said that under communism, matters of politics would become matters merely of administration. In other words, human strife and conflict would come to an end. The major problem with Marx's historical materialism is that the proletariat never really got with its historically assigned role, and it hasn't behaved as it was supposed to, thus undercutting the notion that history is governed by deterministic laws, at least as Marx envisioned them. Again, as a humanist, I personally don't believe that there are any forces outside of the human condition or within it that require that the future will work itself out in some necessary or certain way that we can have much confidence in predicting. Though on the other hand, I should say I do think that there are human propensities that speak to the notion that human society is fluid, and as such suggest that there are certain very broad patterns in the way in which societies change and evolve. In short, what we know about human beings and how they respond to the conditions they face can give rise to a sense of hope with regard to the human future. I need to say more about that. What I mean simply is that the human being is a problem-solving creature, and that there is a natural propensity among us to use our intelligence in order to get beyond our problems in the service of making our lives less oppressive and more pain-free. There is something in people that propels them overall to want to get beyond the forces of oppression, achieve greater freedom in the service of enhancing human flourishing, and to safeguard our well-being. In this sense, Marx, in seeing human history as moving ahead, not in linear fashion, but in broadly dialectical patterns, backs and forths, wherein oppressive and dark times are followed by times of brighter progress may be correct without reducing that dynamic to ironclad laws and ascribing specific roles to specific economic classes. Said most succinctly, bad times are often followed by better ones. Clearly, with the horror of the plague that has been brought upon us in the form of the coronavirus, which seemed to come from nowhere, is in and of itself a catastrophic and frightening and an event of very destructive proportions. As we know, it has virtually brought the global economy to a standstill, and as such has imposed untold anxiety and misery beyond illness and death to countless millions of people. While we are understandably focused on the medical and economic crises in the United States, what's almost, I think, almost totally overlooked is the effect, at least by people in the West, is the effect of the pandemic on the world's poorest countries. Humanity, I should say, has made extraordinary strides in the past 3 decades in reducing global poverty and world hunger. While we are often focused on what's wrong with the human condition, one of society's truly greatest success stories, and we don't appreciate this enough, I think, has been the reduction of world poverty in the last 3 decades, primarily in places such as China, but also in India, which now remains very destitute, but has a burgeoning middle class, and even in such extraordinarily poor countries as Nepal and Bangladesh. Those people earning less than $2 a day has been greatly diminished. Despite the fact that Jesus said, quote, "the poor will always be with us," modern successes in fighting poverty may in fact prove Jesus to have been wrong. There has been serious discussion in development circles of being able to essentially eliminate world poverty by the year 2030, an extraordinary historical achievement. Yet, and this is the tragedy, an underreported element of the pandemic is that these illustrious goals now look as if they have been experiencing a very grave setback. And the coronavirus may well push over 500 million souls once again into extreme poverty, frustrating one of humanity's greatest triumphs. But what the pandemic has done beyond the manifest health crisis it has brought is that it has unmasked chronic problems of social and economic deterioration that we have been suffering for the last 40 years. And here, friends, I want to turn the discussion back to us, back to the United States. George Packer, who writes for The Atlantic, has just come out with a very powerful piece for its online version, which will be published in the June paper edition, making the contention that the United States is in fact a failed state. It's a dystopian vision, but the author's purpose is not to instill us with despair or hopelessness. It is to clarify what we are up against, and he asserts that we have a choice. We can stay hunkered down in the status quo, or we can learn from the best of us who have come forward in this crisis, those who are putting themselves on the line for the sake of others, and use them as an inspiration to rebuild our democracy. I want to read at great length from Packer's article, which I feel is eloquent and powerful in its description of what we are up against. And so he says, when the virus came here, it found a country with serious underlying conditions, and it exploited them ruthlessly. Chronic ills, a corrupt political class, a sclerotic bureaucracy, a heartless economy, a divided and distracted public had gone untreated for years. We had to learn to live uncomfortably with the symptoms. It took the scale and intimacy of a pandemic to expose their severity, to shock Americans with the recognition that we are in the high risk category. The crisis demanded a response that was swift, rational, and collective. The United States reacted instead like Pakistan or Belarus, like a country with shoddy infrastructure and a dysfunctional government whose leaders were too corrupt or stupid to head off mass suffering. The administration squandered 2 irretrievable months to prepare. From the president came willful blindness, scapegoating, boasts, and lies. From his mouthpieces, conspiracy theories and miracle cures. A few senators and corporate executives acted quickly, not to prevent the coming disaster, but to profit from it. When a government doctor tried to warn the public of the danger, the White House took the mic and politicized the message. Every morning in the endless month of March, Americans woke up to find themselves citizens of a failed state. With no national plan, no coherent instructions at all, families, schools, and offices were left to decide on their own whether to shut down and take shelter. When test kits, masks, gowns, and ventilators were found to be in desperately short supply, governors pleaded for them from the White House, which stalled, then called on private enterprise which couldn't deliver. States and cities were forced into bidding wars that left them prey to price gouging and corporate profiteering. Civilians took out their sewing machines to try to keep ill-equipped hospital workers healthy and their patients alive. Russia, Taiwan, and the United Nations sent humanitarian aid to the world's richest power, a beggar nation in utter chaos. Despite countless examples, he says, around the US of individual courage and sacrifice, the failure is national. And it should force a question that most Americans have never had to ask. Do we trust our leaders and one another enough to summon a collective response to a mortal threat? Are we still capable, Packer asks, are we still capable of self-government? Then he says, Trump acquired a federal government crippled by years of right-wing ideological assault, politicization by both parties, and steady defunding. He set about finishing off the job and destroying the professional civil service. He drove out some of the most talented and experienced career officers, left essential positions unfilled, and installed loyalists as commissars over the cowed survivors with one purpose: to serve his own interests. His major legislative accomplishment, one of the largest tax cuts in history, sent hundreds of billions of dollars to corporations and the rich. The beneficiaries flocked to patronize his resorts and line his re-election pockets. If lying was his means for using power, corruption was his end. This was the American landscape that lay open to the virus. In prosperous cities, a class of globally connected desk workers dependent on a class of precarious and invisible service workers. In the countryside, decaying communities in revolt against the modern world. On social media, mutual hatred and endless vituperation among different camps. In the economy, even with full employment, a large and growing gap between triumphant capital and beleaguered labor. In Washington, an empty government led by a con man and his intellectually bankrupt party around the country, a mood of cynical exhaustion with no vision of a shared identity or future, end quote. Wow. What a powerful description of the condition that we are in, according to George Packer. So much for Packer's description. In my own abbreviated historical analysis, I see the road to this dysfunction starting with the visions and the success of Ronald Reagan. Reagan was, in my view, the most successful president of the 20th century, with the possible exception of FDR, if we measure success by the extent to which a leader has been able to apply his vision to the concrete transformation of society. The exact date it started, as I see it, was August 5th, 1981. And maybe some of you recall this event, when rather than meet their demands, Reagan summarily fired over 11,000 striking air traffic controllers. It was the beginning of an assault on organized labor, which virtually destroyed the union movement in this country, so that today barely 7% of all workers are unionized, which means that those who work for a living are bereft of bargaining power. Despite its corruption, the union movement, which people fought and died for in this country, became the foundation that built the most vibrant middle class the world has ever seen. A middle class that now is badly eroding as wages stagnate, fixed expenses rise, and 40%, as we know, 40% of Americans have trouble meeting their monthly bills. But Reagan accomplished a second victory. He taught Americans that government is their enemy. In doing so, he valorized the wealthy and the corporate class, that CEOs and corporate leaders became American icons and our culture heroes. The war on government meant a continuously fraying safety net. Excuse me. A continuously fraying safety net. It empowered the super wealthy and created this extraordinary and immoral wealth gap, which has allowed the top 10% to own 70% of Americans' wealth and the political power that wealth can buy. Such an economic reality, I think, closes the door of opportunity, destroys upward mobility, the American dream is dead, and generates hopelessness among those who work for a living, which in turn causes people to turn inward, to take a parochial turn, to generate resentment, tribalism, and therefore the social divisions that have turned America against itself. It has successfully transformed America into a plutocracy, ruled by those with extraordinary wealth at the top, while the rest of society below essentially is rotted out. It also makes large swaths of the American public vulnerable to the hate-mongering and scapegoating of a demagogue. In my analysis, the emergence of Donald Trump is the end point. The transmogrification of American society, its economy and politics that began with the right-wing ideology laid down 40 years ago. Excuse the cliche, after 40 years, the chickens have come home to roost. Despite the difficult realities, despite the realities which the pandemic directly foists on us, and despite the grim economic realities it has unmasked, I personally refuse to lose hope. Inspired by the broad dialectic that emerges from the propensities of human beings to fight against unjust conditions, we can, I believe, rebuild the society that we deserve. Indeed, friends, we must. History shows that it has been done before, and we can do it again. The bubonic plague that killed up to 60% of Europe's population in the 14th century, and maybe as many as 200 million people, was followed by the flowering of civilization known as the Renaissance. The Civil War was followed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that ended slavery, created birthright citizenship, and extended, at least in principle, not of course always in fact because of Jim Crow, but at least in principle, the right to vote. In more recent times, the Gilded Age of the 19th century, the age of the Industrial Revolution, and the robber barons who grew phenomenally wealthy on the exploited and impoverishment of the immigrant laboring class that occupied teeming slums and substandard tenements, was followed, friends, by the progressive era that brought about reforms at all levels of society from Theodore Roosevelt on down and paved the way for the coming of the New Deal. And the Second World War, in which more than 60 million human beings were killed, which arguably was the nadir of the 10,000-year career of humankind, with Auschwitz and the extensive network of Nazi killing factories, with the dropping of thermonuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Out of the ashes of those unprecedented horrors was born the unification and pacification of Europe, which had been at war with itself for millennia, the decolonization of the peoples of Africa and Asia, the creation of a post-war prosperity, and the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which laid the groundwork for the enfranchisement of widening circles of minorities and oppressed people who had been marginalized from time immemorial. The times we are in should not lead us to despair, I believe, but rather to chart the agenda for what we must do. Echoing that sentiment, Susan Rice, the former National Security Advisor, had an inspiring piece in the New York Times last Wednesday, which answers George Packer's vision with a hopeful voice. Let me, and I shouldn't do this, friends, step out of my professional role and just say in a partisan vein, I think the Democratic Party could do a lot worse than select Susan Rice as Joe Biden's vice presidential running mate. I think she would be a very attractive candidate in this political climate, but that's another discussion. Anyway, she said in the Times last Wednesday, a hallmark of America's strength and resilience has been our ability to seize opportunity amid our greatest crises. And then in a vein similar to mine, she says, after the Civil War, we adopted constitutional amendments to end slavery and enshrine the concept of equal protection under law. In the Great Depression, we established the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. After World War II, we had the GI Bill and founded NATO and the United Nations. During the Vietnam War and Civil Rights era, Congress abolished segregation, secured the right to vote for all Americans, and reinforced our social safety net through the Great Society. As we struggle, she says, through the COVID-19 crisis, the greatest challenge to global health, national security, and our economy since World War II, we must ask again how we can emerge as a more just, equitable, and cohesive nation. Unfortunately, she says, we are today condemned to be led by a president who has no conception of the national interest apart from his personal interest. Donald Trump is obsessed with his image and poll numbers and the Dow Jones average, but sadly, none of the ambitious questions that inspired his predecessors, chiefly how can we exit this crucible of death and hardship as a more decent America. Yet, as destructive and lethal as Mr. Trump's failings are, we cannot afford to miss the moment of reckoning. The coronavirus has laid bare our domestic divisions, unequal economy, and glaring racial and socioeconomic disparities, as well as the fragility of our democracy. To recover from this crisis, it will not suffice. It will not suffice to contain the carnage, reopen, quote, get back to normal. Quote, normal is too costly and deadly for all Americans. End Susan Rice's quote. I personally agree. We cannot return to the past, but Americans need to remake it. America needs to remake itself with a courageously progressive agenda which will repair the devastation and rot which we have become. I don't think that Joe Biden has that vision, but at least I think what can happen is that he can bring around himself better people. But most importantly, we need an inspired mobilization coming from the grassroots, which will force that change and alter American institutions at the highest levels of government. Among the components of that agenda are the following, in my opinion, and this is just a partial list. The economic crisis has laid bare in the most dramatic terms the dysfunctionality of the American healthcare system. We're back to the point wherein 44 million do not have health insurance, which includes more than 13 million who instantaneously lost their coverage when their jobs were shuttered by the pandemic. Tagging your insurance to your employment doesn't work when you don't have a job, or your job doesn't provide those benefits, which increasingly is the case. It doesn't work as more people work for contractors, as independent people, and therefore vulnerable agents. In addition, 38 million people have inadequate insurance, with the ghastly rising expenses of premiums, huge deductibles, and co-pays, which are contrivances that basically, I think, leave a lot of millions of Americans, tens of millions of our fellow Americans in anxiety and misery over their prospects in terms of health. The consequences of the pandemic, I think, have dramatically laid bare the unsustainability of the American healthcare system, which we all know is a global outlier and is the world's most expensive, while producing among the worst outcomes among the rich countries. I fervently favor, personally, not everyone does, but I personally favor a single-payer system. But I predict now that anyone running for public office who does not fervently advocate for universal health care, no matter how it's put together, as a major component of her or his platform, simply will not get elected. History and reality, I believe, friends, are on our side on this one, but we must make sure that it happens. Second, we need to secure solid work and family protection programs. America must build into its federal laws paid family leave, universal sick leave, and subsidized daycare, the costs of which bleed the contemporary working family dry. And we need not a guaranteed minimum wage, but a guaranteed livable wage, so that each and every American can live a life of dignity. The heroes in this pandemic are the health workers, the orderlies, the janitors who clean the hospital rooms, the sanitation people, the grocery clerks, the nurses, and others in our society who are among the least well paid. When the plague is over, that we need remember that life-saving reality and respond to it not with sentimentality or with our thoughts and prayers, but in concrete ways that enable the least among us, who are ethically among the greatest among us. We need to ensure a standard of living worthy of their dignity and their value and the role they place in sustaining a decent and humane society. We need to ensure affordable housing. Homelessness in the world's richest country is simply a disgrace. Except for the Depression, it simply didn't exist before the Reagan years. But with cutbacks in federal subsidies, it is altogether too common. We need to abolish homelessness by providing subsidized housing to those in need of that support. Article 24 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, quote, "Everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay," end quote. A guaranteed vacation may seem trivial, but friends, I think it's not. People struggled hard in the labor movement for time away from their machines. My own grandfather worked in a sweatshop 16 hours a day. Americans today work longer than any people on earth, and I think it's bad for families, bad for children, bad for mental and physical health. Europeans take this right seriously, and it's encoded into their federal laws. Americans, by contrast, are fortunate to get a measly 2 weeks off, if that, and such does not comport with human decency. One's humanity, I believe, extends far more broadly than turning out profits for the boss man. Since the national lockdown, the air we breathe is cleaner than it's been in a very long time. I think it's a harbinger of what we need and what needs to be done if we are to save the environment that sustains us from the ravages of climate destruction. We need, I believe, a Green New Deal that will focus on our economy on jobs that eliminate fossil fuels and and protect our environment. What this agenda entails is what Franklin Roosevelt envisioned when he gave his last State of the Union address in 1944, sometimes referred to as the Second Bill of Rights speech. I've written about it before. In it, he called for 8 economic rights, 8 economic entitlements that would be guaranteed by federal law and therefore not be doled out piecemeal and be subject to the vagaries of politics or the vicissitudes of capitalism. Again, despite strained economies, the Europeans, Canada, and other industrial nations take these rights seriously. The United States, by contrast, does not even in principle recognize economic rights as rights. That is, powerful claims upon the government that the government is obligated to honor and fulfill at the cost of penalty. In my view, Roosevelt's vision should be a rallying cry for the progressive restoration of an America that puts flourishing and welfare of its people first and not profits. What underlies this agenda and its most difficult element is re-envisioning economic power in this country, which means radically transforming who pays taxes and how much. Martin Luther King had once said, quote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed," end quote. The same could be said of justice, including economic justice. Money is power, and those who hold the strings of power will not yield it out of kindness or newly found pangs of conscience. It will only come out of persistent and militant grassroots struggle. The progressive movement, again, of the late 19th and early decades of the 20th century was able to leverage greater economic egalitarianism, with activists applying their programs at all levels of government and society. What we did before, we can do again. But it must start with a powerful vision and be committed to inspiring values. The civil rights movement did not begin with civil rights law, but the laws were a product. They were the endpoint, a product of change in values and movements that began at the grassroots and changed society from below. We are having a major election in November. We must ensure that voting be fair and be readily accessible to all without partisan ruses that basically suppress the franchise. We need to start by putting into office new leaders who articulate this vision of a progressive, decent, and more egalitarian America. And with such leadership in place, it will open the ground for us at the grassroots to push forward a restorative agenda for this country, our country. Finally, as we all know, we are a viciously divided and tribalized society. Xenophobia and racism run very deep and are incited by demagoguery at the top. I do believe that much of this can be traced to the massive wealth disparities in America and the closing of the doors of opportunity which breed hopelessness and resentment. It is interesting, I must note as a footnote, that immigrants we are supposed to despise and keep out of our country are now deemed to be, quote, essential workers, end quote. Much of our problem can be traced to economics, but not all. Much of it is moral. Here we need new inspiring leadership, of which we have had depressingly little in recent decades. We need leadership at all levels that will inspire Americans with a message of inclusion and an enriching pluralism. We need to struggle harder to undo the ugly racism that is so persistent in our society. We need leadership to evoke from us what we have in common with all others, rather than to stoke the differences that divide us. And I think we need to renew our faith in the perennial ideals on which this nation was founded. And I'm not a cynic here. However, we have failed to realize them. The ideals of justice and equality, liberty and opportunity. And I would add to them a profound appreciation of the ethical obligation that we have to one another, friend and stranger alike. And in the best traditions of our own ethical culture movement and with benevolence in our hearts, we need to dedicate ourselves to others to help vouchsafe their flourishing and ensure that all men, women, and children can live a life of security, respect, and dignity. That's my message this morning, friends. I hope when this is beyond us, we can all move ahead to a better future. May you have a good day.
Thank you, Joe.
Bye.
That really is marching orders for us, I think. We actually have time for a few questions. So the same way that you rose your hand for joys and concerns, Rob will also acknowledge raised hands. And we probably will not have time for many, many questions. So we'll see how we go.
Okay, very good. We have Mark Hecht. Mark, you I think you have to unmute there on your device. There you go.
Right. So, yeah, that was an excellent platform, Joe. I really was very good. And I just wanted to make one observation, which I think is going to be a difficulty, but I'm not really sure. I watched a movie this morning called Planet of the Humans. And I don't know if anybody's seen it, by Michael Moore. It's a very cynical movie about the green movement. I think, you know, you have to take things with a grain of salt, but it's suggesting that environmentalists are being taken over by big business and they're sort of working together, and that the solution won't just be environmentally friendly energy and that, but the sustainability of the planet is going to be based upon constraints of our appetite. And if that's required, I think this is going to be the biggest thing that might be facing us as mankind, is to be able to get used to not expecting and having to rearrange the way we consume energy, and to have to put limits on that. Maybe limits on the production of energy and essential minimum right to use the energy at the low. So different minimum allowances to different groups, maybe based upon some form of market, but there will have to be restrictions on how much energy can be produced at the top, and some market forces in between. But basically my point is, in order to achieve this politically, we'll have to have a public and a democracy that will agree to it. But when it comes to restraining appetite, that's a very difficult thing. And I'm afraid that we need to achieve everything you said, but politically going forward, when people are given the asked to restrain their appetite, they rather vote for someone who lets them be a libertine, and the conservative and the business class are trying to fire the fuels of appetite. So I think there's going to be a tension in achieving some of these objectives because of the personal restraint that's going to be required. And I wanted to see what you thought about that.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. I think we're up against a lot, but I think that there has to be a change in the ethics of consumerism. I agree. I think that we have a fetish with market values, and as an ethical culturist, I basically put the highest priority on non-market values, and that's what I preach. And to varying degrees within the context of a middle-class lifestyle, I try to live my life with a certain amount of restraint, and basically not consume what in effect I feel I don't need. Looking at it historically, and again, this was an inflection point. I remember Jimmy Carter, in part, lost a second term to Ronald Reagan because he gave an ill-fated fireside chat. I remember him dressed in his cardigan sweater, imploring Americans to basically consume less in the favor, back then in the 70s, in the favor of a more environmental ethic. And Americans didn't want to hear it. And Ronald Reagan came into office and basically promoted exactly the opposite. He took the solar panels off the White House that Carter had installed, and again valorized the business class and encouraged maximal consumption by Americans. I think that was a big mistake. I think we need the leadership again, and it takes a certain moral leadership and vision to try to shift our objectives in life, both personally and socially, towards greater restraint. I do not think this planet, which will soon have, we have about 7.5 billion souls. It won't be long until we reach 10 billion human beings. We simply cannot sustain this planet, this tired old Earth, unless there is a transvaluation of our values of consumption. We need greater restraint. I agree with you. How to achieve that, of course, is a different question. But thank you. I agree with that perspective.
Very good. All right. We have a question from Pam Berglund. Pam, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was a wonderful, wonderful address that you gave us this morning. But I'd like to ask you to please look at your crystal ball. If we were to go through, we do not know how long this pandemic is going to last. But how long could we actually, as a society, last with such goings on? Could it be a year before we destroy ourselves? Could it be 2 years before we're healthy? What do you see happening to us with all these things? How long can we remain strong and solid?
Well, I don't claim to be a prophet. Obviously, this is an unprecedented retrenchment of the American economy. My feeling is, let me just say, I think that those states such as Georgia, which are opening up rapidly, I think they're moving very precipitously. I think it's a very foolish and dangerous move, and they may find that they'll have to step backward if the virus, in effect, does resurge. And I fear that it might, although no one, again, can predict that with accuracy. I think what we will see over time is a progressive containment of the virus, until we get a vaccine, and the world is working feverishly globally around there in a competitive style to try to come up with a vaccine as fast as we can. Eventually, I'm confident that one will be found. But prior to that, I think the coronavirus will be sufficiently suppressed so that strategically economies will be able to very cautiously open selectively in various places in various ways. We won't go back to where we were before. We'll have to have a society with restraint in that regard. But my feeling is that if it's done intelligently and wisely, we can slowly salvage our economy until the pandemic is vanquished.
Hi, I'll call you back in a little bit.
Yeah, until the pandemic is vanquished and we can rebuild the economy in a robust fashion again. I'm not pessimistic. I tend to be optimistic, but again, the caveat is that nobody in effect has a crystal ball, and nobody can be overly confident about predicting the future.
Let's take a question from Linda. Linda, go ahead.
I'm an interloper today. I'm calling from Austin, New York.
Linda, where are you? I don't, in the mosaic, I don't quite, maybe I have to move over.
You probably can't see me. I'm sitting in a room that's light filtered, and so I don't show up. I'm sorry.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay. I see sort of a ghostly presence. Yeah.
That's
yeah, right. Okay.
A number of years ago, there was a book that came out called The Righteous Mind. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it addressed the fact that this country on both the left and the right has become a society of everybody has to be right all the time, and that there is no place for moderation. I've always felt that if we tried to be moderate and find commonalities among the left and the right, we would possibly be able to create a country that is moving in a direction that will benefit most of us rather than fewer of us. I wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Well, you know, I think in a very tragic way, Barack Obama, who was a true intellectual, by the way, is philosophically a pragmatist, not an ideologue. And he very consciously attempted to build bridges between those on the left and those on the right. And I think it was, he tried that strategy much too long and found that the Republicans were really not willing to be conciliatory in that regard. My hope is that, and I said, we have to get beyond the tribalism. I think we have to elect leaders who hold to the vision that you're articulating. And I think, and again, I'm not a Marxist, but and I'm not an economic determinist, but I really do think a lot of the parochialism that we see in divisions we see in American society have an economic root. Again, I'm repeating my analysis that the wealth gap has closed the doors of opportunity that breed hopelessness, particularly among older white males with regard to their prospects, but more importantly, the prospects of their children, and that this has generated anger, resentment, and causes people to turn inward to seek communion and support with people who share their own ideas politically and are most like them. I think that if we can restore a more egalitarian economy, that those types of divisions will begin to mollify and soften and will open the door for a more pragmatic politics that will bring people together. That's my hope. Can I guarantee it? Of course not. No one can. Will that eventuate? I don't know. Again, no one, I think, can predict the future. But I think it's not implausible if we can get beyond this immoral and I think highly destructive gap in our wealth. And by the way, the founders of our republic held to a similar view. They believed that democracy could not, even though of course democracy at the beginning was highly imperfect, but democracy as they understood it could not flourish if indeed the space between those that is aristocrats who held wealth and everyone else was too large. I mean, that was part of their vision of democracy. And I think democracy is eroding in great measure because of that, primarily because of that wealth gap, but not only because of that. Thank you.
And we have a question now from Marinka Herring. Go ahead, Marinka.
Oh my goodness. All the way from the Netherlands. Right, what a thrill. Okay, Marinka.
Well, it's Peter actually who asked the question.
Oh, Peter asked the question. Hi, Peter, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Thanks very much for your.
You're going to tell me how terribly Holland is doing, right?
I just wanted to come back on that. First, I wanted to come back to the question of Mark, that the planet of the humans is actually being debunked because of a lot of the taping is from 10 years old, and actually renewable energy is worthwhile to invest in without subsidies. The only thing which is indeed right is that, particularly in the Netherlands, we shouldn't use wood chips and see that as renewable. So that just going on your comment, Mark. The other point on PEM is how the corona situation is in Europe. Actually, we do have some countries that started very early with a close down. Among others, Denmark. They have released 3 weeks ago some of the aspects, and indeed they see an uptake in what is so-called the R0, which has indeed gone up from 0.6 to 0.9, so not above 1, and they will further release. In the Netherlands, actually, the situation is that we're still on the close down, although we are releasing slightly. Coming Monday, we will open schools, and actually we see a clear decline in people taking up under the intensive cares, which is now below, well, Netherlands is of course a far smaller country than the US. But we are opening up, but it is expected that it will take quite some time. Another point is that is really quite horrible to see is that there's more than 80, and I happen to be linked with a few people who are working on a vaccine, that there are more than 80 projects going on. And actually Europe is trying to set up a large project where all the countries in the world can participate, so that it is decided that the vaccine will be given to those countries that need it most, which is probably not like the Netherlands, although understandably Trump is actually saying, well, we have to keep it first for ourselves, as you would expect from him, which is of course not the right thing to do. I'll leave it here. I could tell far more.
Okay, no, it's very good. I just 2 comments. It seems as if the Netherlands is actually somewhat ahead of where we are in the United States if you're ready to open schools. That hasn't happened anywhere yet, although there's talk of it in several places. Even though Holland is the most densely populated country in the world, isn't it? Your population density is really is the greatest in the world, and yet somehow you've been able to maintain social distancing. Right.
There is one part of the Netherlands, like in New York and a bit in New Jersey, where the virus has spread extremely high, which is in a part which is called Brabant, and it seems to be linked to also bad air being there, and a festivity which we call Carnival, where people hug and are with lots of people together. So this is one province in the Netherlands who has been affected very much so. Interestingly, Amsterdam, not at all. And to make it personal, both my mother and Marinka's mother are in a situation where they have to be very careful. My mother is in a home for elderly, being 94, but that's a part of the Netherlands where there's hardly any coronavirus. So now we are hoping that they might be released so that I can hug my mother again since 7 weeks. But I'll leave it here.
Okay, let me just ask you one question very quickly, and I suspect we have to end this segment very soon. Do you have any thoughts about the Swedish model? The Swedes are sort of outliers in the way they're approaching this, and trying to create a herd, basically a group of people who have passed through the virus and basically we assume might be immune.
Everybody is watching the Swedes now. The Swedes have, of course, 2 particular things: is that it's not densely populated at all, and there is actually in Stockholm the figures are rising, but they are really the only one who is more going to a kind of a sort of herd immunity. Actually, the UK tried to do that, then came to the conclusion that it's not a good idea. So actually, UK is in a quite dire situation. Swedish is going relatively good, although not as good as Denmark, as I mentioned, because they locked it down very early and are now releasing again.
I think if we had gone the route of the Swedes, our hospitals would have been instantaneously overwhelmed beyond the point where
Yes.
we could cope with. I think that was part of the reasoning that led to our approach, which is the prevailing consensual approach around the world, with few exceptions. Okay.
All
Susan,
right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much all for a very thought-provoking morning. This morning, our online hosts were Rob Eigenbrod and David Bland. Thank you both for bringing us into the virtual meeting room. The recording from today will be posted hopefully sometime this week. This is the time for announcements, and I have the first two.